Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're tackling persuasion. You know, how and why people say yes.
Ah, yes, the age-old question.
And to help us crack this code, we're turning to a classic,
The classic.
Robert Cialdini's Influence. New and expanded. I mean, this book has been around forever for a reason.
It's like the Bible of persuasion.
Exactly, and it's packed with fascinating insights into the psychology of persuasion, like why do free samples work so well? Or
Yeah.
how come we end up buying stuff we didn't even know we needed?
It's like they have some kind of secret mind control powers.
Right, and that's exactly what Cialdini wanted to uncover. He calls these the weapons of influence.
Weapons of influence.
But here's the really cool part. He actually went undercover for 3 years to learn from the masters of persuasion.
Oh, wow, like embedded himself in their world.
Exactly. Salespeople, fundraisers, anyone who is really good at getting people to say yes.
No.
What do you think about that approach?
I think it's genius. I mean, getting that firsthand experience talking to these compliance professionals, really gives them a depth of understanding that you just wouldn't get from a textbook or a lab experiment.
Totally agree. So let's dive into some of his key concepts. One that really jumped out at me was this idea of fixed action patterns.
Click word.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Can you explain what that means for those of us who aren't, psychology PhDs?
Okay, so think of it like this. We humans have these automatic responses to certain triggers, just like animals do.
Oh, like that mother turkey example he talks about.
Right, exactly. So a mother turkey will nurture anything that makes that cheep, cheep sound,
Even if it's a stuffed polecat.
even if it's a stuffed predator.
Yeah.
It's like an instinctual response.
So are you saying that we humans are just as easily fooled?
Well, it's not about being fooled necessarily. These automatic responses, they're actually very helpful most of the time. Imagine if we had to stop and analyze every single decision, every interaction.
We never get anything done.
Right? We'd be paralyzed. So these shortcuts, they allow us to make quick decisions in a complex world.
Okay, so it's like our brains are wired for efficiency, but that efficiency can also make us vulnerable.
Exactly. We can be predictable. And that predictability, that's what compliance professionals exploit.
That's kind of scary when you think about it. Like, we have these blind spots in our thinking that can be used against us.
Well, yeah, think about it like this. They're not really blind spots. They're more like shortcuts. And those shortcuts, they work most of the time, but sometimes they lead us astray, especially when we're dealing with people who know how to use them against us.
Right. So one of these shortcuts Cialdini talks about is this idea that expensive equals good.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic.
Can you remind us of that antique jewelry store story?
Oh, yeah, so this jewelry store owner, he had this turquoise necklace that he couldn't sell for anything.
Nobody wanted it.
Right, so one day he writes to his assistant, and he tells her to mark everything in the display case down by half.
Okay.
But she misread the note, and she doubles the price of everything, including that turquoise necklace. And guess what?
What happened?
It sold right away to a tourist who was convinced that it must be really valuable because it was so expensive.
Wow, that's just crazy.
It is crazy, right? It just goes to show how easily we can be influenced by these simple assumptions,
Our brains just like to take shortcuts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We see a high price tag, we think high quality.
And that's how they get us.
That's one way to get us.
So, okay, let's talk about how these principles are actually used against us. Cialdini's first weapon of influence is reciprocity, this idea that we feel obligated to repay a favor.
Even if we didn't ask for it in the first place.
Right, so is that just basic human decency? I mean, isn't that a good thing?
Oh, it is a good thing. It's what allows society to function, that give and take.
Right.
But like anything else, it can be exploited.
Okay, so how do they do that?
Well, think about those free samples you get at the grocery store.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever noticed how after you try a little piece of cheese or whatever, you kind of feel like you should buy something?
Oh, yeah, I totally do
Yeah.
that.
Right, because you've received something and now you feel this subtle pressure to give something back.
Even if it's just a purchase.
Even if it's just a purchase.
Yeah.
And that's reciprocity at work.
Wow, I never thought about it that way. That makes total sense. And it reminds me of this reader who wrote in about feeling trapped in her job because her boss showered her with gifts.
Oh, wow.
And she felt so obligated to stay even though she was miserable.
That's a great example of how reciprocity can actually limit our freedom of choice. We feel indebted, and that indebtedness can be used to influence our behavior.
So how do we defend ourselves? How do we know when we're being played versus when it's just a genuine act of kindness?
That's a great question. One thing Cialdini suggests is to mentally redefine those gifts as sales tactics.
Oh, that's interesting.
So ask yourself, would I feel obligated to reciprocate if this wasn't connected to a potential sale?
Mm-hmm.
So if the answer is no, then you might be dealing with someone who's trying to manipulate you.
I like that. That's a really good tip.
It's all about being aware of the context.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about reciprocity. Let's move on to Cialdini's next principle, liking. This one seems pretty straightforward. We're more likely to say yes to people we like, but there's more to it than that, right?
Oh yeah, there's a lot more to it than that. It's not just about genuine liking. Compliance professionals have all sorts of tricks up their sleeves to make you like them.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, for one thing, they might try to create a sense of similarity.
Oh, like finding common ground?
Exactly. So they might mention that they went to the same school as you or that they're a fan of the same sports team.
Even if they're totally making it up.
Even if they're totally making it up. They're just trying to find anything that will create a connection.
So it's like they're building rapport, but it's all manufactured.
It can be, yeah. And another tactic they might use is to give you compliments.
Oh, yeah. Everyone loves compliments.
Exactly. It makes you feel good, and it makes you more likely to trust the person who's giving them to you.
But those compliments could be completely insincere.
They could be.
Oh.
Yeah, it's all part of the game.
So it sounds like we need to be careful about who we trust.
We do. It's important to be aware of these tactics and to not let our guard down too easily.
Especially when someone's trying to sell us something.
Especially when someone's trying to sell us something.
This reminds me of a question we got from a reader who was feeling pressured to buy things at Tupperware parties hosted by friends.
Oh yeah, that's a classic example.
Because it's like, you don't want to disappoint your friend, but you also don't want to buy a bunch of stuff you don't need.
Right. So it's a tough situation to be in. And it just goes to show how these principles of influence can be used in our personal lives too.
Absolutely. So how do we deal with that kind of situation? I mean, how do we say no without hurting our friends' feelings?
Well, I think the key is to be honest and assertive. You can explain that you're not really in the market for any Tupperware right now.
And if they're a good friend, they'll understand.
They should understand. And if they don't, then maybe they're not such a good friend after all.
Okay, so liking is a powerful tool of influence, but it's important to be aware of how it can be used against us.
Exactly.
So Cialdini's next principle is social proof, the idea that we look to others to decide what to believe or how to act.
Monkey see, monkey do.
Exactly. It's like that herd mentality.
It is.
Yeah.
Now, we see a bunch of people doing something. We assume they must know something we don't.
So we follow along.
We follow along. And that's how compliance professionals use social proof to their advantage. They create the illusion of popularity.
So how do they do that?
Well, they might use testimonials from satisfied customers.
Oh, yeah, those are everywhere.
They are, yeah. And they can be very effective because we tend to trust other people's experiences more than we trust advertising.
It's like we're getting a recommendation from a friend.
Exactly. And they might also use statistics or data to show that a lot of people are already using their product or service.
You know, it's funny you mention that because I have this story. I was at this train station once. It was super crowded, and I was just standing there waiting for my train. And all of a sudden, I noticed this group of people all huddled by one of the doors, and they all start moving in unison to another door further down the platform.
Did you know any of them?
No, I didn't know any of them, but for some reason, I just instinctively followed them. Like I was part of their group.
What?
And then a few minutes later, the whole group moves back to the original door.
What?
I'm telling you, I felt like a sheepdog herding myself. I never did figure out what that was all about.
That is amazing. It's like that scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail where they're all running away from the killer rabbit.
Exactly. It's that herd mentality in action.
And it just goes to show how powerful social proof can be, even when it's completely irrational.
Yeah, I mean, there was no logical reason for me to follow those people.
But you did.
I did. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's done that.
Oh, no, you're definitely not alone. We're all susceptible to social proof to some extent.
So, okay, back to compliance professionals. How do they use this to manipulate us?
Well, as we were talking about, they might use testimonials or statistics to create that illusion of popularity.
Right.
But they might also use things like bestseller labels or limited time offers.
To make it seem like everyone's buying it.
Exactly. They want to create a sense of agency and FOMO, that fear of missing out.
Oh, yeah. FOMO is a powerful motivator.
It is, and that's how they get you to buy stuff you don't need.
That's sneaky.
It is sneaky, but it's also very effective.
So knowing this, how do we avoid falling for it?
Well, I think the key is to be aware of the tactic and to ask yourself, do I really want this, or am I just being influenced by the crowd?
Right. So basically, we need to think for ourselves and not just blindly follow the herd.
Exactly. We need to be critical thinkers and question the information that we're being given.
Oh, okay, that's great advice. So we've covered reciprocity, liking, and social proof. Now let's move on to Cialdini's next weapon of influence, authority. Why are we so susceptible to this one?
Well, I think it goes back to our childhood.
Oh, how so?
Well, from a very young age, we're taught to obey authority figures, our parents, our teachers, the police. We're told that respecting authority keeps us safe and keeps society running smoothly.
Right, but it also makes us vulnerable to manipulation.
Absolutely.
Well,
Because we're so used to deferring to authority figures, we don't always stop to question their motives or their expertise.
and that can be dangerous.
It can be very dangerous. Cialdini points to Milgram's famous obedience experiments as proof of this.
Oh yeah, those are pretty disturbing.
They were. People were willing to administer what they believed were painful electric shocks to another person simply because a scientist in a white coat told them to do it.
It's amazing how easily we can surrender our own judgment in the presence of authority.
It is.
Oh,
And it's not just actual authority figures that can trigger this response. It can be symbols of authority, too.
like what?
Well, think about titles. Uniforms, expensive cars, anything that conveys a sense of power or status.
So it's like our brains are wired to defer to anyone who looks or acts like they're in charge.
Exactly. And that's how compliance professionals use authority to their advantage. They might wear a uniform or use a fancy title to make themselves seem more credible,
Even if they don't actually know what they're talking about.
even if they don't actually know what they're talking about.
That's scary.
It is scary, and it's important to be aware of these tactics so that we don't fall for them.
So how do we protect ourselves from this? How do we distinguish between legitimate authority and someone who's just trying to exploit our natural inclination to obey?
Well, Cialdini suggests asking ourselves two key questions. First, is this authority truly an expert? Don't be fooled by titles or appearances. Look for evidence of real knowledge and experience.
Okay, and what's the second question?
The second question is, how truthful can we expect this expert to be?
Yeah.
Consider their motives, their potential biases. Do they have something to gain by persuading you?
That's a really important point. We need to be critical thinkers and not just blindly accept what we're told.
Exactly. We need to do our own research and come to our own conclusions.
I like that. Do your research come to your own conclusions?
It's all about taking control of our own decision-making.
And not letting others manipulate us.
Exactly.
So we've covered reciprocity, liking social proof and authority.
That's 4 out of 6 of Cialdini's weapons of influence.
We're on a roll.
We are.
Let's take a quick break and we'll be back to tackle the last two.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we're back and ready to dive into the last two of Cialdini's weapons of influence. Where were we?
We left off talking about authority and how easily we can be swayed by those in positions of power, or even just those who appear to be in charge.
Yeah, and how important it is to question authority and not just blindly follow orders.
Exactly. It's all about being a critical thinker.
Right. So what's next on Cialdini's list?
Well, the next principle is scarcity. This one's all about how we tend to value things more when they're rare or hard to get.
Oh, yeah, like limited time offers or those Black Friday sales where everyone goes crazy.
Exactly. Scarcity creates this sense of urgency, this fear of missing out that can make us act impulsively.
It's like our brains go into overdrive.
Yeah, we start thinking, I got to get this now or I'll miss out.
Cialdini talks about that new Coke fiasco where people were hoarding the old Coke once it was discontinued. It's like they didn't even realize how much they loved it until it was gone.
It's funny how that works, isn't it? We take things for granted until they're no longer available.
Totally. And then suddenly we're willing to pay anything to get them back.
It's like that saying, you don't know what you've got till it's gone.
Exactly. So how do compliance professionals use this principle against us?
Well, they use all sorts of tactics to create that sense of scarcity. They might offer a limited number of products or services.
Oh, like those limited edition sneakers that everyone goes crazy for.
Exactly. Or they might set a deadline for a sale.
Like act now or you'll miss out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We want to create that fear of missing out, that FOMO.
Because they know it works.
It does work. And it's not just about things being objectively scarce.
Yeah.
Even the perception of scarcity can trigger that desire.
Oh, interesting. Can you give me an example?
Sure. Think about those going out of business sales. They often mark up the prices before they mark them down, so it seems like a bigger deal.
So we think we're getting a better deal than we actually are.
Exactly. Or they might create a sense of scarcity by implying that there's a lot of competition for the product or service.
Like this is the last one in stock.
Exactly. They want to make you feel like you have to act fast before someone else snatches it up.
So knowing this, how do we avoid falling prey to these scarcity tactics? Because that fear of missing out can be really powerful.
It can be really powerful. But I think the key is to take a step back and ask yourself, do I really need this? Or am I just being swayed by the scarcity principle?
So basically, we need to check our impulses.
Exactly. We need to be aware of the tactic and make a conscious decision about whether or not we want to buy into it.
Right. So don't let those sneaky marketers get the best of you.
Exactly. Think for yourself.
Okay, so we've talked about reciprocity, liking social proof authority, and scarcity. That brings us to Cialdini's final weapon of influence, commitment, and consistency.
Ah, yes. The power of sticking to our word.
Why is this such a strong motivator for us?
Well, I think it has to do with our sense of self. We want to see ourselves as consistent, reliable individuals.
I want to be true to our word.
Exactly. So once we make a commitment, even a small one, we feel internal pressure to act in ways that align with that commitment.
It's like we don't want to be hypocrites.
Right. And compliance professionals know this. They know that if they can get you to make a small commitment, they're more likely to get you to make a bigger one later on.
Oh, like that foot in the door technique?
Exactly. You know, where they ask you for a small favor and then later ask for a bigger one.
Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. Cialdini talks about a study where researchers asked people to sign a petition supporting state beautification.
Okay, seems harmless enough.
Right. But then 2 weeks later, those same people were asked if they would be willing to display a large drive carefully signed in their yard.
And I'm guessing they were more likely to say yes.
Exactly. The people who had signed the petition were much more likely to agree to display the sign than those who hadn't.
Wow, that's pretty crazy.
It is. It shows how even a small commitment can make us more likely to comply with a larger request later on.
So it's like we're setting a precedent.
Exactly. We're creating a sense of obligation.
And compliance professionals are masters at exploiting that obligation.
They are. They might get you to agree to a free trial or a low introductory offer, knowing that once you've made that initial commitment, you'll be more likely to stay on as a paying customer.
That's sneaky.
It is sneaky,
Yeah.
but it's also very effective.
So how do we avoid falling for this tactic? I mean, we don't want to be pushovers, but we also don't want to be rude and say no to everything.
That's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
I think the key is to be aware of the principle and to be mindful of the commitments we're making.
So don't agree to anything you're not comfortable with.
Exactly. And if you do make a commitment and then realize you don't want to follow through, it's okay to change your mind.
You're allowed to say no.
You are. It's your right. And sometimes it's actually the best thing you can do for yourself.
So don't be afraid to speak up.
Exactly. Be assertive.
This has been a fascinating deep dive into Cialdini's 6 weapons of influence. We've covered reciprocity, liking social proof authority, scarcity, and commitment, and consistency.
Phew. That's a lot to take in.
It is, but it's also incredibly valuable knowledge. I mean, now that we're aware of these principles, we can start to recognize them in our own lives.
And hopefully avoid being manipulated by them.
Exactly. So listeners, pay attention to these weapons of influence in action. See if you can spot them in advertising, in your interactions with others, even in your own decision-making.
And remember, these principles can also be used for good.
That's a great point. So if you're trying to persuade someone to do something positive like donate to a charity or volunteer their time, you can use these principles ethically to increase your chances of success.
That's all about using your powers for good.
I love that. Using your powers for good. So to wrap things up, we highly recommend checking out Cialdini's book, Influence for Yourself. It's a fascinating read, and it's full of even more insights into the psychology of persuasion.
And be sure to join us next time for another deep dive into a different topic.
Until then, thanks for listening. All right, so we covered a lot of ground in the last segment: reciprocity, liking social proof, and authority.
4 down, 2 to go.
Exactly. So let's jump right back into Cialdini's weapons of influence. What's next?
Okay, so next up we have scarcity. And this principle is all about how we tend to value things more when they're, well, scarce, hard to get.
Oh, yeah. This one's definitely ingrained in us. Like those limited time offers, they always get me.
Oh, absolutely. Limited time offers, sales that end at midnight, all that stuff.
Yeah.
It creates this sense of urgency, like we have to act now or we'll miss out.
It's like our brains just can't resist a good deal.
Right. And it's not even just about the deal itself. It's about the feeling of scarcity that makes it so appealing.
Okay, so how do compliance professionals use this against us? I mean, besides those limited time offers.
Well, they might also use things like limited availability,
Mm-hmm.
like saying there are only a few items left in stock.
Oh, yeah, that always gets me. I'm like, I gotta get it before it's gone.
Exactly. Or they might use exclusive information, like giving you access to a secret sale or a special discount that's not available to the general public.
Makes you feel special.
Right. It makes you feel like you're in the know, like you're part of a select group.
And that makes you more likely to buy.
Exactly. It's all about creating that sense of exclusivity and desirability.
So Cialdini talks about the new Coke fiasco as an example of this, right?
Oh yeah, that's a classic example.
Uh,
So Coca-Cola, they decided to change their formula for Coke.
and nobody liked it.
Nobody liked it.
Yeah.
But once they discontinued the old Coke, everybody went crazy trying to get their hands on it.
It's like they didn't even realize how much they loved the original until it was gone.
Exactly. And that's the power of scarcity.
Yeah.
It can make us value things more than we ever did before.
So knowing this, how do we avoid falling prey to these scarcity tactics? Because that fear of missing out can be really powerful.
Yeah, it can be tough to resist.
Mhm.
But I think the key is to just be aware of the tactic. You know, when you feel that urge to buy something just because it's scarce, take a step back and ask yourself, do I really need this? Or am I just being influenced by the scarcity principle?
Good advice. Pause and reassess.
Exactly. Take a deep breath and think it through.
Okay, so we've talked about reciprocity, liking social proof, authority, and scarcity. That brings us to Cialdini's final weapon of influence, commitment, and consistency.
Ah, yes. This one is all about our desire to be consistent with our past actions and commitments.
We like to see ourselves as reliable people.
Exactly. So once we've made a commitment, even a small one, we feel pressure to follow through with it.
Like we don't want to go back on our word.
Right. And that's what makes this principle so powerful. Compliance professionals can use it to get us to do things we would normally do.
So how does that work?
Well, one tactic is the foot in the door technique. You know, where they get you to agree to a small request and then later ask for a bigger one.
Oh yeah, like those salespeople who ask if you have a minute to talk and then try to sell you something?
Exactly. Or those charities that ask you to sign a petition and then later ask for a donation.
So it's like they're getting us to commit to the cause in a small way.
Exactly. And once we've made that small commitment, we're more likely to agree to a larger one later on because we want to be consistent with our past actions.
It's like we've already invested in the idea.
Right. And we don't want to feel like we've wasted our time or energy.
Cialdini talks about a study where researchers asked people to sign a petition supporting state beautification.
Right. And then later they asked those same people if they would be willing to display a large drive hole, carefully sign in their yard.
And I'm guessing the people who signed the petition were more likely to say yes?
You guessed it. They were much more likely to agree to display the sign than those who hadn't signed the petition.
Wow, that's pretty amazing.
It is. It just goes to show how powerful this principle can be.
So knowing this, how do we avoid falling for this tactic?
Well, I think the key is to be aware of the principle and to be mindful of the commitments we're making.
So don't agree to anything you're not comfortable with.
Exactly. And if you do make a commitment and then you realize you don't want to follow through, it's okay to change your mind.
We're allowed to say no.
Absolutely. You have the right to say no to anything you don't want to do.
So don't be afraid to speak up for yourself.
Exactly. Be assertive and stand your ground.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into Cialdini's 6 weapons of influence. We've covered reciprocity, liking, social proof authority, scarcity and commitment, and consistency.
That's quite a toolkit of persuasion techniques.
It is. But now that we're aware of these principles, we can be more mindful of how they're being used on us and hopefully make more informed decisions.
Exactly.
Knowledge is power. I love that. So, listeners, as you go about your day, pay attention to these weapons of influence in action. See if you can spot them in advertising, in your interactions with others, even in your own decision-making.
It's like a fun little game.
Exactly. And remember, these principles can be used for good as well. So if you're trying to persuade someone to do something positive, like donate to a charity or volunteer their time, you can use these principles ethically to increase your chances of success.
It's all about using your influence wisely.
This has been a great discussion. I really appreciate your insights.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, would highly recommend checking out Cialdini's book, Influence for Yourself. It's a fascinating read, and it's full of even more insights into the psychology of persuasion.
And be sure to join us next time for another deep dive into a different topic.
Until then, thanks for listening.